Hello, everybody. This is John Yeager. Another episode of Cast Matters. We continue our series on the family office. We've released 4 so far, with a couple to go. And today we're excited to talk to Greg Silverman, who's been in the family office space for 20 plus years and is doing a lot of work with family offices around their technology stack, their governance process, and those type of things. So, welcome, Greg.
Thanks for having me, John.
Absolutely.
Appreciate it.
Why don't you tell us about you, your background, the company you started, and kind of what you're doing for clients?
Yeah, so John, thanks for having me. Started my career back in 2005 with Geller here in New York City, where I'm visiting from. Uh, my role there was in investment operations, helping build reporting systems, implementing various technologies, and leading a team. That experience sort of was foundational for the rest of my career as I moved on to another family office in Miami, Florida, helping with IT infrastructure and their reporting platforms. Um, Again, spent about 6 years there. And with that 15 years of experience across those two family offices, just felt like I had a knack for this technology space, and ultimately led me to get into consulting and learn more platforms, learn about additional challenges in the industry. And joined a firm called Verosoft in 2019, where I, as a senior consultant, worked with firms that looked a lot different than sort of the family offices that I started with, right? So, your institutional asset managers, your wealth management conglomerates, and got to see sort of all the different technologies inside these firms and how they interact and how they integrate. And I just felt like family offices, right? They have a really unique set of problems, and uh, to address that, they don't just need tools; they need a strategy. And that's where I found myself often in the consulting world, is on that strategy side and helping firms think through, what's the best combination of tools and what's the best strategy to get that across. And ultimately, that's what led me to found Clarity Edge in 2023, my consulting firm dedicated to family offices and their technology challenges, and helping them think through the right tools. And especially in this day and age where data and AI is such an important topic, I just want to make sure family offices are prepared for what's ahead. And that's where my focus is today.
Absolutely. No, that's awesome. You and I got connected when you were at Verisoft, and have kind of continued through that. So I really appreciate you coming on, because I do think from our experiences with working with family offices, but a lot of what we've seen, and I think it's changing because of work that you're doing and others, is people used to like go in and try to solve one problem and pick a tool to solve that problem, and then another problem pops up and they pick another tool to solve that problem without the overall strategy and governance process.
Yeah, it's key, right? A lot of firms think that they know, oh yeah, this tool, that tool, that's all I need, and we just implement and we're done. I think I don't want to say that there aren't leading tools out there that we see often, but it actually does take a lot more planning and sort of thought than just what tools do I need to buy and am I getting the best deal on it, right? Part of it is really just, and I know we're going to talk about this later, John, is just being adaptable, and how do you keep that adaptability and flexibility going forward.
And it's not really about the technology as it is more about what's the output you're trying to get. How are you going to get the output? What's the output format going to look like? How is it going to help you run the family office better and more efficiently? Then you work back from there to figure out what technology you need to in order to achieve that goal, right?
100%, right? And it sounds very general and basic, but yeah, what are your inputs? What are your outputs? What is the information you're working with today, and what are you trying to do with it? What does ultimately the final product need to look like today, tomorrow, next year, right? And helping firms think through that. And just on that topic, right? We probably heard this quote recently. The CEO of Microsoft, Satya Nadella, just recently said, software as a service is dying, right? And it's going to be replaced by agents. What does he mean by that? It's really
Hmm.
like means that it's really not about the tools anymore as much as the data that you're using, right? So I don't think we're quite there yet, but we're going to be there soon.
Absolutely. Yeah, agentic AI is kind of what I hear a lot about is and I joked about I was actually speaking at the DCPA Digital CPA conference. So I was on a panel for AI, what little I know about it. Um, but we're joking that Whitley Penn's going to have a agentic AI agent, and the clients are going to ask it a question. It's going to go to the Sage Intacct, agentic AI, ask, ask the question, get the answer, and then put it back. So all the
Yeah.
agentic AI agents are going to do all the work in the background, and it'll only escalate to us when, maybe there's a bigger issue that we have to actually jump in and talk through. So I don't know how close we are to that, but it was just kind of interesting to talk about how those AI agents are going to be able to talk to each other.
It is really interesting, right? And certainly all the tools that we're working with today are building their own AI agents on top of that, right? So we can get into that tool. Is that what we mean by control and ownership of data?
Right.
When you have a tool that has an agent on top of it, we can make an argument either way, but I would argue probably not, right? Because when you think about the data itself, right, the data is valuable to the vendor too, and
Yes.
what they're saying is, let us do it. Let us take your data. Let us govern it. Let us derive insight for you, and then sell it back to you.
Right.
Um, and I think that's something that's going to have to change for some. Well, it has started changing, right, for the larger firms. They've but prior to this sort of AI being so in focus, larger firms have been making investments in data for decades, right?
Yep.
So a lot of firms are already prepared for what's here. So what I'm helping firms do is sort of catch up to this and just say, get control of your data, get ownership of your data in place to remain flexible, to remain adaptable, and ultimately for this, AI revolution that's basically here and coming. And what is AI going to do for family offices? We could probably have another podcast about that,
Yeah. Right.
right?
Yep.
But I think we could come up with practical examples, but just the idea of being prepared and thinking ahead is really where we want to be, because I don't think anybody out there really knows exactly how well AI will be, or the priority of which AI will take over things inside the family office. But we do know that data investment is important, and it's something we got to think about right now.
Well, you threw out a term in there, kind of owning your data, and so kind of want to jump in and explore that a little bit. AI is helping a lot of industries, and they get the data and they help do the analysis and those kind of things, and a lot of that is great. But you also have to think about, especially if you're a family office that have so much security and privacy issues because of how personal the data is. How are you going to actually use AI without it being sucked into the world of AI vortex and having that data exposed to the world? So let's talk about kind of the beginnings of the owning of data, and then maybe why, kind of going into why it's important and how to mine through all this, how to walk through all this minefield.
Yeah, John, no, absolutely. And maybe even just zooming out, right? What do we even mean by family office data, right? So investment data, right? Your trading histories, your positions, performance calculations, risk metrics, exposure, your managers' track records, and your historical asset allocation, all those things, right? That's your data, right? And then you have your entities, your corporate structures, your tax jurisdictions where things are domiciled, your partnerships, um, and then obviously the tax focus, right? Your tax works papers, your tax lots, your philanthropy,
Personal
all
balance
those
sheet.
books and records, right? So there's so much, and then your banking data, right? That's really the personal stuff, right? Your wire
Yep.
instructions, your account numbers, your credit relationships. So people get the idea, right? That's all the data. So the really question is like, you own all of that legally, right? It's yours. But the real question is what's the operational sort of control you have on that data, right? Do you have a sovereign infrastructure, right? Is it infrastructure that you own? Is that data live there, or is it all live in a vendor platform? So those are some of the ideas, right? And again, I jotted down some ideas because I knew we were going to talk about this, but um, having the idea of having the data that you control, that you could clean and you can govern by your own standards, right? And a lot of the times that could be sort of a co-managed process with the vendor. But oftentimes it's best when you have control of that and you explain your expectation to the vendor, right? So it's that practical control, structured, managed on your terms. And then, that falls into all those areas we talked about, but as well as making different systems and platforms talk to each other, right? So when data is clean and it's well structured, you have a much cleaner way and a much more understandable way, um, you know, so that you could sort of bring everything together in your office.
Absolutely. And so let's talk about some of those um, ways that you can do that. So we've talked about kind of what is owning your data, why is it important. So what are you seeing? What do you recommend to your clients these days? What are you seeing best practice? How does that, you know, how are you working with your clients to, kind of ensure that's happening for them?
I think the simplest way to put it is, can you get your data out of these platforms, right? And getting the data in, right? What we talked about, all that data we talked about up front, all the custodian feeds, your alternative investments, all of that's feeding into your reporting and accounting systems. Let's just say one day that you decide you want to switch one of your systems. Is it easy? Is it possible to get the data out of that system and move it to another system? Do you know how to get the data out? Do you know what data to look for? Um, and that's really it. I mean, the ability to switch vendors without losing your historical data is such a paramount piece of this. And then also, that's the why the flexibility is so important, right? And what does that mean when data is trapped inside of a vendor platform? Well, it means an expensive, costly migration process, right? So that's the one piece of it, right? But I think even more, what I'm really trying to educate folks on, because that's not a new concept, is this idea of why data is a strategic asset, right? And why it's not, it's like anything else in your portfolio, and it needs to be treated as such. And I think what I was alluding to earlier, John, was that the vendors have seen that, and that's why there's been such a push to have those agents inside your current software, because obviously they want you to keep your data in the system, and they want to have the primary governance over that. And I think that doesn't mean you want to not use their platforms. It just means you want to have your own control. I'll give a perfect example. When I logged into my computer this morning, ChatGPT was down,
Hmm.
and that's not a family office system. But you can imagine any other SaaS platform logging into it and seeing that it's down, right? You don't have control over that infrastructure. The data may only live there for you. So basically, you're at the mercy of the vendor, and you're not able to get at your data. So wait, what does that mean? So what tools have I helped clients with for that scenario? Well, you might have heard of the term data warehouse or data lake, or even just data governance. You might have heard the term API. All this means is, we're going to have the data somewhere else so that we can access it, and somewhere else securely, that we could control, that we could put our own security standards around, that then we can do what we want with it, and we could keep it separate from what the vendor's doing with it, and we could keep the
Right.
vendor accountable. So that's really key in things like reconciliation. That's really key in things like, did this wire transfer actually go out? Did this trade get executed? Um, Rather than being completely reactive, right, to what is happening. And I think
Right.
that's another good way to think about it, right? Is owning your data and controlling your data means you're proactive rather than reactive.
Yep. Well, it's about putting the right processes in place, right? I mean, that's what we talked about on the accounting side, right?
$100%.
Do you have controls? Do you have conflict? Are you able to remove conflicts? The internal control process, does the same person, kind of book the data as reconcile the data? There's all kind of risk associated with that. So are you thinking about, and it's the same on the investment side of things too, or, the same person that's handling the wire transfers also reconciling, the custodial statements, right? So there's a lot of those kind of, obviously as a CPA firm, we focus a lot on that, but obviously, there's a lot of process that goes into it as well. It's not just the technology platforms.
Exactly. And I mentioned the software as a service, uh, and I think we've seen over the last, let's call it, decade or so, that software as a service sort of replacing your traditional on-prem database software. You can even make the argument now that those days of database softwares actually gave you that control and sovereignty that I'm helping firms realize was such an asset before. And I'm not saying to move away from software as a service. What I'm saying is there's ways to remain adaptable, control your data, and have governance while still using these software as a service tools. And just know that, like we talked about earlier, they're probably not here to stay. So it's best to remain adaptable and have control and ownership of your data someplace. And there's ways to do that without breaking the bank.
We obviously we're big fans of Sage Intacct in the family office space, and it's a great platform. It obviously is SaaS. We're comfortable with their SOC compliance and uptime and hows and those kind of things. But it sounds like what you're, talking about is, and I'd be interested to kind of hear a little bit more about it, is you're talking to your family offices about then creating that data lake. So you're pulling data from, say, an Addepar, say from the banks, the custodial, from the GL system, all those kind of things into a data lake, so that now you have this big relational database that you can run analytics and reconciliation checks and those kind of things. Am I interpreting what you're saying correct?
Yes. And it's not like that's a product that I'm, let's call it selling, but that's
Sure.
sort of the educational piece, which is like,
Yep.
well, what are our options out there to do that? Right. And there are firms out there that help with that, right? A Collation AI, for example. There are others. There are also ways to do that independently, right? You could think about how maybe you want to have your own bots that you create yourself, right? And you may have a developer on staff to do that. But again, it's really not so much about always about a data lake, but it is about just understanding, is my data somewhere where I could access it securely?
Yep.
And that gets back to that API phrase I mentioned earlier,
Yep.
application program interface, right? Where
Hmm.
we're using that to efficiently move the data to where it needs to go, either into your own database, into another system, into, you know, hope they're not doing this, a spreadsheet or something like that. But essentially, it's just making sure that you have that access. So you mentioned Addepar and Sage. That's a good one, right? And that's ultimately where it's not only even about the integration, but creating some meaningful analysis between the two systems, right? So obviously, our friends over at Knowledger help bridge the gap between Sage and Addepar, but even more so when you have a database between them. Um, yeah, certainly you could do the integration, but there's all those rules. It's more about then taking the data sets together and deriving the analytics that you need, right? For example, can we make this donation, to the university this quarter based on our cash flows that we're seeing in Addepar and what's going out in Sage, right? And can
Yep.
we bring all that together and come up with that analysis? So that's where it's having, everybody calls it the single source of truth, but it's more just a place where all the analysis can take place, right? And then obviously we mentioned AI a few times. When you put the AI layer on top of that, eventually, you're becoming your own what used to be software that you purchased. You're doing that yourself. You own your data. You're adding, intelligence on top of that, and you're deriving the output that you need.
So I know we're kind of running close to time, but I want to dive into one last point, which is we started talking about it before, which is, the ability to use the data to create the right metrics to run the operation better and more cohesively. And so there's obviously a cash flow forecasting aspect that you mentioned, but then there's metrics around that, and you have to get access to the data to then create metrics to then run the organization with. So, can you
Mm-hmm.
give a little background and maybe a little case study of a client that you worked with and how you accomplished that?
Certainly. And there are a few different ways, John, right? Like, so outside of the normal financial management of a family office, right? The investments and accounting side, family offices also sometimes have operating companies. And those operating companies will have their own data requirements and let's call it reporting requirements that they need to work through. Um, Quick example would be family office I work with had an oil and gas related operating company. The people in the family office were responsible for helping manage data associated with that and helping to report on it. And the process basically looked like a lot of Excel spreadsheets that were then sort of combed through manually and then entered in, and then charts and graphs created in Excel. Sort of a very manual, clunky process, and it took a lot of the team's time. So, as an example, there we sort of took that Excel data using some Python scripts. We structured it in a row and column format, had it governed in a way that we could be confident in it, and that we were going to not spend so much time formatting it every day, and then layered on top a Power BI report that could be refreshed every day on that data to give them the analysis and metrics they need. So maybe not the most, let's call it, practical example for every family office, but giving you an example of how you could take sort of a problem with how your data is structured and then layer reporting on top of it without, let's call it, adding platforms or applications on top. So a pretty light, from a a software perspective, but definitely more focus on just making sure your data is clean and structured. And I think that's the same way we think about it when we talk about something like cash flow forecasting, right?
Yep. Yep.
Um, Making sure that you have all of those investments and all of those assets tagged in a way that you could really be confident that your projections are coming out correctly. And that's not just that could be, to use two simple examples that we already touched on earlier, things like softwares like Sage Intact and Addepar, right? Using data structured in a way in Addepar with attributes, and using data structured in a way in Sage with location codes for different dimensions, you could come up with a way to really come up with a data structure that's going to allow you to accurately forecast cash or anything else. And as a practical example, there, you could potentially not have to add on or have additional spreadsheets or data that you're working with, and sort of have it streamlined in one place. So ultimately, it comes down to understanding the data points, understanding your inputs, and making sure that you have control over them, so you can get the right output. Right? Um, it's got to be on your terms, and it's got to be under your control.
Absolutely. Well, I appreciate the oil and gas example. Obviously, being a Texas-based CPA firm, that's our jam right there. We've had family offices that have a number of oil wells, and so we've had to work with them to use the Sage dimensions to track their oil wells and get their information so they can have that view. We have a mineral rights team, so a lot of family offices have own and lease and do all kinds of things with the mineral rights, and so we have a whole
Mhm.
team that works with that. And then obviously when you get to the analytics, bringing into Power BI or Tableau or DataSelf into that analysis so that you can have that analytical platform, is great, and a lot of our clients take advantage of that too. So um, I know you didn't mean to kind of do a commercial for us, but you know, we love the oil and gas space, kind of a natural space. But I think you're right. I mean, the example you talked about is applicable across the board. Whether you got an art collection, you got a car collection, a yacht manufacturing company, an oil and gas company, whatever it might be from an operations standpoint, you still have to treat it as a business and be able to get the information out and put the metrics together and run it most effectively.
Yeah, John. When we talk about you know folks using Excel, it's always good to you know and not scold them for using Excel, and make sure um, that they just get that data in a place where they're governing it, they're formatting it, they're treating it like the asset that it is. And you don't have to throw out the baby with the bathwater. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Excel is a great tool, and but it can be a good reporting tool. It can feed other tools. I think the key is that you know the other side of the SaaS environment is it's made things a lot more cost effective, and the cost of ownership and support go down dramatically. Used to when you ERP system and you have to put an SAP, you're going to spend millions of dollars versus now you got Sage and you can spend $1,000 a month and get a really good platform. And the same with Power BI. Power BI is free as part of your Office toolkit. You just have to learn how to use it a little bit and those kind of
Yeah.
things. But it's just amazing, kind of the like you said, you don't have to break the bank to get a lot of this. A lot of the money you might spend is actually working with folks like you and us to maximize the use of those tools to get exactly what you want out of them, because they can be a challenge to use at times. And so, at the end of the day, they're also, pretty straightforward to use.
Exactly. And look, Excel can be where the data is, could stay there, but I think ultimately things like broken links, version control, maybe one person knows how to use the spreadsheet.
Yep.
Maybe there is some error in the spreadsheet that you can't find.
Yep.
So it's always good to audit those things, and it's always good to then bring it into a place where you're not so reliant on several sheets and have it in one place. And that's where we could, in an engagement, we'd go through what are the cost benefits of going to, let's call it, an Azure based database, and on Microsoft Cloud, versus what if we did that locally on a secure server in your office, versus what if we just use the Excel spreadsheet as the source of the data, right?
Right.
um, there's best practices we go through, we decide what's the best for the client, right? But ultimately, I think my whole point in mentioning this was it's actually a good thing if you have your data someplace, and it's a good thing if you're actually taking your data out of your platforms, doing things with it, doing analysis on it. But we got to take a look at what you're doing and then say, like, is this sustainable for the future? Are you governing it in the right way? And can we do this better? But I really wanted to make sure that we don't sort of scare folks away and be like, well, I'm relying on this spreadsheet, I'm relying on that data. It doesn't go anywhere. It's just trying to make you more efficient, trying to take your business to the next level, trying to prepare you for what's coming in, 2025.
Absolutely. And who knows what that is?
Can only guess.
So I think I'm gonna wrap up the episode. This has been a fantastic conversation, Greg. I appreciate you taking the time. If the listeners want to learn more, reach out to you, kind of understand more about what you do, how would they reach you?
Yeah, no, absolutely, John. They could find me on LinkedIn, Greg Silverman. They could find Clarity Edge, my company name, on LinkedIn, or clarityedgellc.com.
Awesome. Well, again, appreciate it, and I'm sure we'll talk again soon. And this wraps up another episode of Cast Matters. Thanks everyone for tuning in, and please watch out for the future episodes as we continue to delve into the family office space. Everybody have a great day.
Thanks, John.